Anna Pitoniak is the author of Necessary People and the Futures. Before becoming a full-time author, she worked in book publishing, including a senior editor at Random House. Anna grew up in Whistler, British Columbia. She graduated from Yale and lives in New York City. The New York Times, I have to read part of this review. The New York Times calls Our American Friend elegant and well-paced. Emily in Paris meets Scandal, fantastic fun. Anna skillfully nests each Russian doll inside the next, keeping each chapter of the story intact as she builds a new one around it. Joining Anna in conversation this evening, we are so thrilled to welcome Lara Prescott. Lara received her MFA from the Michener Center for Writers at the University of Texas. She was previously an animal protection advocate and political campaign operative. Her stories have appeared in the Southern Review, the Hudson Review, Crazy Horse, Day One, and Tin House Flash Fridays. She won the 2016 Crazy Horse Fiction Prize for the first chapter of her debut novel, The Secrets We Kept, which was an instant New York Times bestseller and a Reese Witherspoon Hello Sunshine book club pick. So without further ado, please help me in giving a warm digital on-screen welcome to our featured guests, Anna Pitoniak and Lara Prescott. Take it away, ladies.
Thank you guys so much. I am so excited to talk to Anna about her gorgeous novel, Our American Friend, which I just absolutely devoured. It was the type of book that was meant for me to read it because it has so many of my interests: Russia, spies, literature, all kinds of things just wrapped into one. And so I'm so happy to be able to pick your brain about how this wonderful novel came into being. So my first question for you, in your own words, and not to give away any spoilers for those of you who haven't read this wonderful novel yet, can you tell me a little bit about how what Our American Friend is about?
Yes. First of all, thank you for that, Lara. That is such a beautiful and generous introduction, and Dana's was as well. And I'm so happy to be in conversation with you in particular, because I just have to plug The Secrets We Kept, and what a beautiful and enchanting book that was. And I think that we have a lot of overlap in interests and themes in our fiction. So Our American Friend is the story of a complicated and ultimately very high stakes relationship between two different women. One of them is First Lady Lara Kane, a enigmatic and mysterious wife of a bombastic and brash president who was born in Soviet Russia, grew up in Moscow and Paris, and has this very mysterious past that the American public knows little about. Then we have the journalist Sophie Morse, a former White House correspondent who thinks she's left behind Washington and politics forever, until Lara asks her to write her biography and share the story with a world that she's never shared with anyone before. So as Sophie begins to write Lara's story and the relationship between these two women grows deeper, a certain trust builds up between them, but there's always the sense that maybe something isn't quite as it seems. So this is the story of how Sophie discovers certain explosive secrets in Lara's past and then has to decide what to do with those secrets. Does she prioritize her relationship with the First Lady, or does she do what might be the more difficult but ultimately right thing? So that's a little preview of what the story is about. But it's really the story of two women who each in their own way has to wrestle with the question of what's the right thing to do? How do I stand up for what I believe in?
For that. I mean, Our American Friend is so interesting to me. It's one of my favorite types of novels where it kind of blends different genres in this really pleasing way. It's literary fiction. It has a romantic angle, but it's also a spy story in many ways. A political thriller. It has a lot of suspense to it. And, you know, something I've thought of a lot is, you know, the spy genre in particular has long been dominated historically by male writers who mostly write from a male perspective. So at the center of your novel, as you said, there's two powerful women. There's Sophie Morse, the journalist, and First Lady Lara Kane. And I was wondering, why did you decide to stick to these women's perspectives? And was that important to you?
It was definitely important to me to stick to their perspectives. There are men who come in and out of the story who have important roles to play, but I always knew that I wanted to focus on the unique perspectives and experiences of these women. I think that part of the reason we've seen such a skew in terms of spy stories being told, whether in novels or on TV, was probably this long-standing misconception that only male readers are interested in this kind of story. You know, only stories centered around men are going to sell well or resonate with audiences, which I just don't think is true. And I think finally the culture is catching up to that. It's certainly something we saw with your novel and the success of that, you know, and other works of fiction, other movies and TV shows, ranging from Homeland to The Americans to a number of other things. I think that women have obviously been present at all of these pivotal moments throughout history, whether it's the Cold War, whether it's World War II, whether it's something in American history, whether it's something in a different country on the other side of the world. But for a variety of reasons, the perspectives of those women are often not the ones showcased front and center. So I think that we as, you know, novelists, as storytellers, it's not just that we maybe have a responsibility to tell the stories that haven't been told before, but in fact, I think it's an incredible opportunity as a storyteller to explore these new perspectives, because it gives your story a certain freshness, a certain unique jolt of energy. So I loved the idea of talking about this moment in history that we're in right now, that we just lived through, where there's a lot of tumultuous things happening in Washington, D.C., where there's a certain amount of tension and ambiguity between America and Russia, and where does America stand in the world. But rather than centering, you know, the bombastic president in this story, I really wanted to focus on the women whose stories might be lesser told. Which isn't to say that this is a story that is completely and wholly based on our reality, because it very much isn't. I sort of took a couple of seeds, used them as a jumping off point, and then went in my own direction, knowing that I didn't want to write about the real First Lady or the real president. And so as I was working my way into the story and getting to know these characters, I was also able to marry it with this kind of political thriller espionage element. But I knew that it was very important to the women I was writing about that they be the ones ultimately making the decision. You know, they're the ones steering the ship. They're the ones who are deciding what's happening to them. So I didn't want to kind of hand over all of that power or influence to a male character in the story. I wanted these women to feel both the empowerment and maybe the burden of having to really be the central player in that drama.
Speaking of Lara Kane, I think she is such a wonderful, fascinating character. And, you know, when she first comes onto the scene, you can't help but draw the comparisons, as you said, to Melania Trump and her cold exterior, her beauty, just, you know, impeccably dressed and very quiet, very stone faced. And what one of the thrill is, and I'm not going to give away anything, but that when she's slowly revealed to be so much more. And I was just wondering, you know, how did that evolution come about? Were you initially inspired by Melania and then said, like, I'm going to write a Melania type character, and then changed your mind? Or did you always have this evolution in mind?
It's a great question. And it's sort of a little bit of both, I guess. So the initial seed of the idea, I got back in the spring of 2016 when I read this magazine profile of Melania Trump, who at that point was just the wife of the candidate. He hadn't yet been elected to the presidency. And the profile was only able to reveal a certain amount about her past, because even to this day, very little is known about her upbringing, about her sort of life before she married Donald Trump, but there were a couple of little details that stuck out to me. She grew up in Yugoslavia, which of course was a communist country, and a country in which a lot of people were not well off, where they, lived lives of quite a deal of deprivation. But her father was very well connected. He was a member of the Communist Party, loyal to that ideology, had a job that allowed the family to live in very comfortable circumstances. So she had that sort of special privileged position growing up in Yugoslavia within the confines of that ideology. And then you fast forward 20, 30 years to present day, and she's living in a completely different sort of system, the capitalist country that is America. She's also risen to this position of extreme power and privilege within that system. And I found myself thinking, like, what a mind warp that must be to have grown up in one circumstance and to have wound up in a very different circumstance. And would something have happened along the way that would allow her to sort of explain that evolution to herself? Did something happen to change her mind or set her off on that course? I sat there for a little while and thought about, is this something I would want to write about in fiction? I realized I was incredibly intrigued by these questions, but I also realized there was no way for me to find out what had actually happened to Melania Trump, because she's not talking.
Yeah.
Really, no one else in her tight inner circle is talking. I also realized that I wasn't sure I could personally gin up enough sympathy for the real Melania Trump to want to step completely inside of her shoes. So it was a very conscious decision to take those elements that I was curious and intrigued about, that kind of span from growing up under communism in the Cold War to winding up here in the present day. I wanted to write about that and explore those questions, but have the character in my story be someone who was her own independent person. I mean, independent from reality, someone who could emerge organically from my own imagination and creative process. And as soon as I made that decision, and also crucially made the decision to include Sophie's perspective in the story, because I think Sophie wrestles quite a lot with questions of, is it okay to give this kind of person attention or even empathy? Does it make me complicit in what Lara Kane is doing? And by extension, does it make me complicit in what President Kane is doing? That was really important in allowing me to kind of plunge more fully into this story and imagine a world that certainly has resemblances to our own, but also diverges in crucial ways.
It's so interesting how you have one question in your mind. I think this is how a lot of books, a lot of novels come into play or come about. It's you have a question and you want to answer that, and that leads you to another question and a different type of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you put that, you had this unanswerable question, which led you to this inspiration of this character that, has so many layers, as I said, but is so interesting to discover as the novel progresses. And I think just on the craft of writing, if we can get into that just a little bit, I was wondering, how did you go about writing this novel? Did you work from an outline? Did you have note cards? How did you weave in historical elements with this fiction? Just, I'm so fascinated by authors and their process. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Me too. I always wished if I could have one superpower, it would be to make myself a fly on the wall. So like I could watch you while you were writing at your desk, or any number of writers. I do think it's so interesting. So I have never been particularly good at planning things out ahead of time. I really wish I was. I think it would probably save me a lot of time and energy. I often go into the writing of my novels, and this is true with Our American Friend, with an idea of maybe the central ultimate conflict that I'm driving towards, like the big conspiracy that's going to be unwound sometime in the last quarter of the book, let's say. But I don't know how I'm going to get from here at the beginning to that point. And I sort of have to figure that out along the way. So what happens is that I wind up writing a first draft in which I'm really not working on the basis of much of an outline at that point. I'm feeling it out as I go, where I'm sort of working out the story beats as part of that process. But more critically, I'm getting to know the characters. For me, it's very hard to predict or plot out what a given character is going to do until I've actually gotten to know them. And the way I get to know them is simply by spending time with them, hanging out with them day after day after day, watching them move and speak and take certain actions within a scene. So then what usually happens, what's always happened for me, is I'll get to the end of the first draft. I'll have figured out roughly the architecture of the story, and I'll have figured out a little bit more who these characters are, what makes them tick, what motivates them. But then the first draft is a complete Frankenstein of a mess. It's like 10 different things bolted together. I've often dropped storylines along the way. And the first draft is usually so discombobulated that it makes no sense to try and fix that draft. Usually I've had some bolt of clarity in the process that makes me see the whole thing in a much tighter way. So then I go and I start a second draft, blank slate. Sometimes I'll pick up little bits and pieces from the first draft, like a paragraph here and there will survive intact, but I'm pretty much writing the second draft from scratch. The second draft goes much more quickly. I can move through it a lot faster, but it's my very inefficient way of moving through the material. It also means that as I'm writing the first draft, as I'm working out those story beats, getting to know the characters, I'm also doing research simultaneous with the first draft. I think some novelists maybe are able to sit down, do a bunch of research, metabolize all of it, and then go into the writing of the fiction. I like to do the two side by side just to kind of keep that variety in my day. So the research that I'm doing, and primarily it's just through reading and taking lots of notes as I'm reading, picking up little tidbits here and there. Those tidbits I pick up from research will sometimes feed in to the way I'm thinking about the story. Like, oh, this thing happened in Moscow in 1988, and isn't that fascinating? Like maybe the character in my story would have experienced something like this, and then that helps build the world out. So the whole process of the first draft is really like the world building, figuring out the story, figuring out the characters, and figuring out the little tidbits of reality that I'd like to draw into it.
I feel like we have similar processes as a fellow inefficient writer, and
good. I'm glad to hear it.
For that first draft. But I think that exploration is essential, and then you get to where you need to go in the revisions. Do you think that your experience as an editor has helped you with that eye for the revision process, where kind of what's working and what's not working maybe a little quicker than you would have before? Or is it difficult to apply that critical eye or that almost outsider eye to your own work?
I think that it's hard for me, as is hard for probably all writers, to be very objective or critical about my own work. Like I am just as much in need of an editor as any writer under the sun. And my editor at SNS is a great testament to that. She makes my books so much better. I do think that my experience of working as an editor has maybe made me less precious about my work at various stages in the process. I've never, even though I can find the revision process, tricky at times, because it's like you have to solve these different problems and figure out solutions, I've never found it particularly, painful or arduous to cut a bunch of scenes or slash these paragraphs, or to just simply recognize that that element of the story that I once upon a time thought was a really good idea is actually not a good idea and it's kind of extraneous. I think as a writer, if you can hold your own work somewhat lightly, and it's that tricky blend, right? Of you want to take it really seriously because it's important, your creative process, but also not take it too seriously, because at the end of the day, you have to be able to communicate whatever it is you're trying to say to another person. And that has to involve a certain amount of fluidity and flexibility. So I think working as an editor just taught me to not be too rigid in my conception of a book at any stage in the process. Sometimes you get to the very final revision, the copy edit or the galley pages, and that's when you realize, oh, you know what? That chapter, that scene is actually not working. Let me just cut it. and it's pretty late in the game, but you want to keep that open-minded, receptive quality throughout the whole process.
Yeah, definitely. That's great to hear, because I think that is a skill that's hard for writers to learn, is when to let go. And sometimes it takes a while, but I think I'm still learning in that process too.
Yeah. Well, it's hard because it's you sort of have to, if you're writing the book in order to communicate something to a reader or to the outside world, and the reader / the outside world isn't understanding what it is you're trying to say, or isn't able to penetrate into that truth you've created, then, that's like a problem that needs fixing. I think that most writers ultimately want to have themselves, heard and understood by their readership. And it's something I always have to reckon with. It's like a little bit of a blow to your ego when you realize that, oh, this hasn't quite landed with people. But if you can just keep an open mind on that, that's the trick.
So something to kind of go along that line of writing the book and how it came about, and you touched on research a bit. And I know in your acknowledgments, you said you read so many books. You read histories, you read novels, you read biographies, and some of those books really changed your understanding of certain historical events and really broadened what you were writing about. And I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that, and if there were any particular books that you could recommend for the audience to pick up if they really want to learn more about this really fascinating period during the Cold War.
Yeah. There are a couple of books that I can recommend off the top of my head that are all have relevance to Russia and the Cold War, but are sort of a little bit all over the map. So one book that was just a fantastic kind of take you inside the machinery of the KGB and the MI6 and the CIA at the height of the Cold War is this narrative nonfiction called The Spy and the Traitor by Ben McIntyre. He's a British writer. He's written a number of these sort of real life spy stories that they really and truly read like a novel. I remember picking up this book and not being able to put it down. I raced through it in 24 hours. It tells the famous story of a spy named Oleg Gordievsky, who escapes from Moscow in, I think it's 1985 or 1986. And if you're a fan of John le Carré, if you love the TV show The Americans, if you are just intrigued or fascinated at all by the KGB, like, this book is just totally captivating. For a more sort of serious history bent, I really loved and got a lot of value from David Remnick's book called Lennon's Tomb, which is about the final days of the Soviet Union in the sort of late 80s and early 90s. It just gave such a colorful and deeply reported and fascinating portrait of Moscow in that time of transition. What I loved reading about it is that I, personally had no memories or really strong awareness of that time. So I was learning a lot. And that time, of course, is different from present day, but you can also really see the parallels to our present moment, just in terms of how, the leadership in the Kremlin might conduct themselves, or what the Russian people want out of their leaders, or what they value, or what they push back against. And that really helped me sort of deepen my understanding of that particular transitional moment in history. And then the last book I'll recommend, very different from those other two, is this beautiful memoir by Francine Duplessis Gray called Them, which is about her parents, who are both Russian emigres who left Russia after the revolution in the 20th century. And it's about her growing up primarily in New York City, in this kind of captivating atmosphere that was filled with these amazing Russian men and women who are so cultured and so sophisticated and so colorful. And it was a really useful way for me to almost pretend, like, what would it have been like to grow up in this family of Russian emigres? So that has a really sort of delicious, almost dessert-like quality to it.
Yeah, I am interested in Part of the reason I was so interested in your book was that focus on towards the end of the Cold War. And for those of you who haven't read it, Our American Friend has two different timelines. One's like a present day timeline, and the other takes place during the sort of final days of the Soviet Union. And it is what you said a little bit. You said, that time period does, for me, really speak to the present moment in really strange ways. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on, one, why you chose that time period. I mean, there's so many spy stories, so much going on during the Cold War. Why was that time period fascinating for you? And how do you think it speaks to the present moment?
I think that the reason that sort of mid to late 1980s became really interesting to me was in doing my research for this book, I read several books that kind of described the whole span of the Cold War from, the arguably 1946 and then the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and onward. And there were various moments throughout the Cold War of, really heightened tension and then sort of more of a détente or relaxation setting in. And I find it fascinating that I think for a while in the 70s, tensions had sort of quieted down a little bit between the Soviet Union and America. But when you had Ronald Reagan come into the White House in 1981, it was ratcheted right back up because of his rhetoric, because of the way he chose to engage. And the heightening of that tension was sort of irresistible to me in terms of opportunities for drama and high stakes standoff. I also find it so interesting because now with retrospect, we know that those were sort of the final days of the Cold War, that it was only a few more years to go until the Soviet Union was gone and the war was over. But of course, in the moment, in the year 1988, 1989, no one living through that moment actually knew that the end was just around the corner. It was entirely possible to think this might go on for another 5, 10, 20, who knows how many years. So I find that particularly interesting and rewarding to try and situate myself in that perspective where maybe the Cold War would go on forever, and what would that day-to-day lived reality feel like? And of course, the Cold War did end. The Soviet Union sort of dissolved. We had Yeltsin, we had Putin, but in another way, and we're very much seeing this in the headlines today, the Cold War is kind of back. And I think you could almost argue that, did the Cold War end and then a new one began, or did it sort of just go into this underground state for a long time and now it's come back? So I think there are fascinating parallels and differences between the 1980s and now in terms of, Russia wanting to assert herself on the world stage, be taken seriously, maybe rectify a sense of having been humiliated or mistreated in the past by America. I do think the fact that, and I read a couple of biographies of Putin as part of the research process for this book, even though Putin doesn't figure into the book, I'm a little bit of I'm like a vacuum cleaner in my research. I just like to read everything, even though it's far more than I actually need. I think the fact that Putin himself was a KGB officer in the late 80s, early 90s, that he saw this kind of very humbling end to the Soviet Union certainly informs the way he conducts himself and postures himself on the world stage today. This sense of maybe nursing an old wound of humiliation.
Yeah, I think I've thought many times, has the Cold War even ended? So
exactly.
I think with the two alternating timelines, it's fascinating to see, how the past affects the present of the novel and how things have evolved and slowly started to change, and how one person goes from this sort of life in the Soviet Union, or from Paris to the Soviet Union to the United States, is really a testament to your abilities in research and instilling those details into a work of fiction, which makes it so real and the characters come alive so much. So that's not a question, that's just a compliment to you.
Oh, thank you.
But one other thing, I heard that you did some traveling as part of your research. You went to Moscow, and I also heard that you you went to CIA headquarters in Langley, and I would
That's
be
right.
fascinated to hear how each of those experiences went, how they informed the novel, and which one gave you the most, I guess, fodder for the novel.
Yeah. They were both such fascinating experiences. I actually traveled to Russia in like late September, early October 2019, so not long before the pandemic, and then spent a day at CIA headquarters in late October 2019. So I sort of crammed it all into that particular month. Glad I got that done before the lockdown occurred. Both were incredibly valuable. Going to Russia was really, really cool. I had just always wanted to go there. I've always been fascinated by Russia. I think in many ways, writing this book was just my excuse to like dive into this fascination I've always had. It was important to me in the way that I wrote these scenes that took place in Moscow, that they feel that they have some measure of reality and texture to them. There's big chunks of the book that take place in Paris, that take place in New York and Washington. And I've had the benefit of spending some time in all of those places, certainly New York, because I live here. So I know what it's like to, walk down the sidewalk, sit in a restaurant, observe the people in a park. And my goal is always to write fiction that feels very transporting and very real for a reader. And I was aware in trying to write those scenes in Moscow that I just didn't know what it was like to walk down those sidewalks, to kind of interact with the people in that city. Now, Moscow of 2019 is vastly different from the Moscow of 1989, but certain things hold true. There's a good amount you can absorb just by osmosis, but I also hired a tour guide to take me around Moscow, through the Red Square, through parts of the Kremlin Museum. For one of the days we were there, and I asked her a million questions about her experience during the Cold War. She gave me a lot of great details. And then my visit to the CIA headquarters was really interesting and a great way of sort of filling out the other side of that picture. Like, okay, if I can describe Moscow and Paris to you, that's great. That's an important part of this book, but I also want you to be able to feel and understand what it's like for an officer to be recruiting an agent and convincing him or her to turn against their country and, put their life on the line for the sake of spying. And again, I had gleaned a lot of that from research, from reading a lot of these books, but I talked to a couple of people at CIA. One is an in-house psychologist, another is an in-house historian, both of whom have worked there for decades. One of whom used to work as a case officer in Berlin in the 1970s and 80s. So they were able to answer a lot of my nitty-gritty questions about, how would someone approach a target like this? What would the conversation be like? How would you convince this person to trust you and to really make this big leap? One little nugget about that CIA visit that I really liked was, I was in there, I was talking to these folks about the book I was writing. And this is something they've done before. They'll bring in a novelist, they'll bring in a screenwriter in an effort to help them get the texture of this world right. But the psychologist who I was talking to that day, who herself is a woman, said, we've had plenty of people come in before sitting where you're sitting at the table right now, but I have to say, it's very refreshing to be talking to a woman for a change.
Oh,
And
wow. Yeah.
I was very pleased by that because I do think that, primarily these stories get told by men, by male writers. And, I'm happy to be doing a teeny tiny little bit to help correct that long imbalance.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating how spot on you got just like the mechanics of spy work and what a handoff is and what that's like to train to do that and all of the signals and all of the like sleight of hands that take place to accomplish passing on information and also how these people are recruited and the long game of it all. It's nothing that's really instant. This is like a long game and people are coming at it from all of these different reasons and most, which I think you really understand. I won't say too much, but you get why people make the decisions they make, and it makes sense. And that's something that's so well done and exciting to read, I think. And, along with being a spy story, at the heart of this novel is a real romance, a first love story, which I just devoured. I absolutely love Sasha, the character, and the relationship. And I was wondering, did you always have in mind to have those two stories working together? Where did the romance come from?
So it was really interesting when I started writing the character of Lara Kane, and more specifically writing those biographical scenes that take place in the past, the stories from the 1970s and 80s that take place in Moscow and Paris, which she is telling to Sophie as part of this biographical process. And we as the reader of the book get to read basically those snippets of the biography in process. I knew that I would, wind up unwinding a lot of Lara's past in the telling of those stories in the biographical format, but I wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen to her. This was sort of like that exploratory process we were talking about with the first draft. I knew that something would happen to cause her to, question her loyalties. But part of me getting to know Lara was also getting to know her within the context of the people around her. So for me, Lara really started to come alive when I could see her in settings with her family, her mother and her father and her sister, all of whom she's very close with, when they're taking trips together or sharing family meals, or just having these sort of day-to-day domestic experiences. I loved writing those scenes because it was a way for me to really build empathy for this character and feel a certain closeness to her, even though the Lara of present day is this very cold, stoic, sort of icy first lady figure. So those scenes were really humanizing to write. And then the scenes with Sasha were like that to the max. I think that once I saw Lara, as this 14, 15-year-old girl fall in love with this idealistic young man who really opens her eyes and opens up her conception of what's possible in the world, it made my empathy and connection to her go even deeper, and really allowed me to develop a lot of tenderness for her. Which is an interesting thing to hold in balance with a kind of critical perspective on her in the present day. Like, I think that just because she had these experiences in her past, does it excuse what she's doing in the present? Does it mean that I condone it? Like, no, not necessarily, but it makes me able to understand it more clearly. And I think that's really the goal of Sophie in writing this biography of the First Lady, is to try and understand, why is she the way she is today? It doesn't necessarily mean that through that act of trying to understand her that she's going to agree with her or endorse what she's doing, but that act in and of itself, I think, is a valuable thing for Sophie to undertake, and for me to undertake as a writer, and I think in some ways for readers to undertake. It's a woman you may not think is sympathetic at the outset of the story, and you may not be sympathetic to her by the end either, but along the way you might learn some things about her past, her sort of tragic romantic love story with Sasha, the way she relates to her family, that will affect the way you see her.
Yeah, it was very well done and smart move, the way you wrote it, as here's the biography in the process of writing it as a form of flashback to Lara's history. And also I had major Russian novel vibes between those two and that tragic romance. So I absolutely adored that. I have so many questions for you, and I think I'm running out of time. But I wanted to ask, one of the questions, I was really fascinated with the theme of the role of art and how it factors into different characters' lives. With Sophie, the writing; with Lara, she's an artist. And it really seems like it's a way for them to both process the world, process grief, and just escape, but also so much that is a part of them. And I was wondering, is that something that resonated with you personally in your writing? And was that a theme you were trying to get to readers?
Yeah, I'm so happy you picked up on that and are pointing that out. I was very aware of, at certain moments in the story, when a character, especially Lara, because as you said, she has this kind of visual affinity. She loves to sketch and to draw. This this connection with visual art is something she has through her whole life. I was aware, when I would kind of imagine these scenes, play them out in my mind, that when Lara was in a state of great turmoil or conflict, often the way she could access a sense of grace was through art, because it had the ability to pull her outside of herself for those few powerful moments. I think often when we feel trapped in our own head, trapped in our own pain or heartbreak or confusion or whatever it might be, it takes something pretty powerful and robust to sort of break through our own, our own turmoil and remind us of the bigger perspective of the world. And I found it sort of happened naturally as I was writing these scenes with Lara, that when she was able to access grace, it was often when she was in the presence of some really beautiful art, often visual art. Sometimes it's a painting in a museum. Sometimes it's the very act of taking out her sketchbook at a sidewalk cafe in Paris. But I think she is able to feel connected to other people and other histories and other traditions through that artwork. And it helps alleviate whatever, pain she might be feeling in that moment. And that to me is such a rewarding part of writing fiction is, you put your characters in these stressful situations. You've made life really hard on them. You've put all these crazy things into motion in the plot. But every once in a while, they have a sort of little awakening where they realize, oh, this is what I'm meant to do. This is who I really am. This is what I really care about. And I think for every character, the way that those insights arrive can be a little bit different. But yeah, for Lara, it's often with artwork that she feels that awakening.
Yeah, and it made me think about Lara as the First Lady and her expression of self through the decor, through their clothing, even like that visual aspect of her character is something that progresses throughout her life and is expressed in different ways. And it just made so much more sense to me to understand that character and how she is maybe speaking out or speaking her mind, but through this very different way and through a visual way. So I love that. I loved that exploration.
Yeah, it was fun to do that.
So I don't know, do I have time for more questions, or Dana, am I out of time?
Well, I don't want to cut you guys off because this conversation is just so entrancing. We do have a few questions that have rolled on in from our audience. So if you don't mind, I will just go over a few of these. Okay, I know you spoke a bit about your writing process, but Liz wants to know, when you're writing and become frustrated or stuck, what are some things you do to get back on track?
Well, that happens more days than it doesn't happen. I find myself frustrated and stuck quite frequently. I think that part of it is, first of all, recognizing when you are genuinely stuck versus recognizing when you're working on something that just happens to be particularly tricky or difficult. Lara, I don't know if you find this in your writing, but sometimes I have days where I will work steadily for a couple of hours and I might get like whole paragraphs written, like get a page written, 2 pages written. It's just flowing like water. Other days I'll spend that 2 hours, I'll be working really intensely and all I'll manage is like 4 or 5 sentences. But those are 4 or 5 really important sentences. And I'm not actually stuck in that moment. I'm just like really figuring out some crucial bit of the plot. But other days, yeah, I'm just totally like up against a wall and like the juices aren't flowing. So on days when I can recognize that that's where I am and I'm kind of stuck, I try to find other things to do that feel generative or like they're contributing to my fiction practice in some way, even if it doesn't involve actually like sitting there typing, writing fiction. So that might mean like switching gears for a moment and picking up that book that has those nuggets of research that I've been meaning to dive more deeply into for the book I'm writing. Or it might mean, going back to some scene at the beginning of the book and tinkering it with a little bit, just so I can keep my hands in the novel without putting the pressure on myself of having to produce new writing that day. Other days, it means going for a walk and listening to a podcast where, someone's interviewing Elizabeth Gilbert talking about the creative process. Or I do find that hearing other writers or other artists talk about their own creativity, their own struggles with creativity, their own sources of inspiration, that is always such a relief to me because it makes me feel like I'm less alone in whatever I'm struggling with. And it usually gives me a little jolt of energy for the next day. So I think that it's hard as a writer because you're sort of by yourself at your desk most of the day. Some people find great writing groups, which can be so valuable. But there's a number of ways to find that sense of community and kinship with fellow writers. And for me, I love putting in a podcast and going for a walk in Central Park and feeling like, I'm talking to my friends in my head and we're all, griping about what we're doing today. And I find that very comforting.
What about you, Lara?
Oh, same thing. I think something that I always take to heart is when the author George Saunders came to my MFA program to talk to us, and he was basically real straightforward. And he's like, the first draft is just going to be, terrible. And the real problem, the real hardship of a writer is to game yourself to come every day and keep at it and not just throw in the towel because what you're working on that day isn't flowing, or you just think the rest of, the thousands of words you've written before are terrible. It's really gaming yourself to get in the chair and keep going. But like Anna says, there's more than one ways to write. It's not always at the desk. I think a lot of my ideas come at while I'm taking a walk with my dog or while I'm driving and I suddenly figure something out. There's something said to be interesting where you're doing something with your body and all of a sudden something clicks. You're like, I got the structure. I got this character. I figured it out. So I think something that's fun about writing a novel is you're always thinking of those characters. They're always with you in some way. So even if you're stuck one day, that doesn't mean that, if you don't take a break and just walk away and then come back, but keep coming back. I think that's the point of it. I think writers have this compulsion and to just keep coming back, even though they can't really explain why.
Mm-hmm.
Great advice. I hear you both saying, just don't stop. Don't get discouraged.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, the whole thing's discouraging. Like
it's crazy. It's a crazy way to try and spend your days and make a living.
The best writers in the world will say the same thing, and they say it never gets easier. So
yeah, I know.
Another question, a little bit about process. How did you approach switching back and forth between past memories and the present narrative without it feeling formulaic? Did it feel clear to you when a vignette felt complete?
It's a very good question. I think that switching back and forth between the two was actually a really good way for me to maintain my own interest and engagement in the writing of the story. Like I could kind of tell, it was like a way of introducing sort of natural breathing points to the manuscript where I might finish writing a scene in present day where Sophie's in the White House talking to Laura Kane and something dramatic is happening in Washington. That scene would come to an end and it felt like a natural moment to like step back from this and like, let's go back in time to Paris and see this scene unfolding in this time. As to the sort of natural stopping points of the vignettes, I probably had like a decent intuition of, okay, this is where I'm going to bring the curtain down. But this is where the editor becomes crucial because often I would go on a little too long or I might include a few more scenes than I would actually need. And in revision, my editor would point out, like, this is a little more than we need, or we could make it move a little faster here. And she was always right. I would take those notes, and the manuscript would feel much more coherent as a result. And at various points in the revision process, I did sort of look at the arrangement of present day story versus past story, and like, was the balance right? Was the alternation in rhythm right? And I did move some bits and pieces around here and there, but for the most part, it's not like I conceived of them as two separate threads that I then mashed together. It's like the whole way through, they were conceived of as one. Because I think that if you were to just read the biography by itself, or just read the present day story by itself, it would feel really incomplete and lacking. I think they're very much sort of two sides of the same coin, or braided together in a really really necessary way.
Yeah, the reflections of each other. I mean, that's something that's excited about the structure you chose, is when we do go back, it's for a point. It's not just some random thing. They're each enmeshed with each other. They each speak to each other, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
And it really is so beautifully crafted. Lara, when you said you devoured it, it's just exactly it. Okay, now I know we don't want to give away any spoilers, but Mike from the audience would like to know, why doesn't President Kane do anything about Sophie's meetings with Lara?
I think, and this sort of connects to something we were talking about earlier in terms of why women get overlooked in these stories, in these worlds. I think women often get underestimated. And I think certainly someone like President Kane, who is so, so high on his own ego, so wrapped up in his own stuff, like, he, at the end of the day, isn't thinking about anybody but himself. So he would never think to pay attention to some sort of boring old journalist who's like not even that important or powerful, who's meeting with his wife. Like, who cares? I think that's his sort of dismissive brush off of the relationship between Lara and Sophie, which of course is, ultimately something that becomes a problem for him. But I think more broadly, we so often keep our focus on the people who are in the spotlight, whose voices are the loudest, who are just saying me the whole time. And we pay less attention to the people sort of operating on the margins or in the shadows, who speak a little more softly, who play things closer to the vest. I mean, this can be true of a woman like Lara Kane. It can be true of sort of spies more broadly. They're the definition of people who operate in the shadows. But I find this so fascinating as a novelist to explore the people who get a little bit overlooked, but who are actually, wielding a good deal of influence, who are making certain things happen that the public may not be paying attention to. And I think that this is probably something that has occurred throughout history, where we've thought that, so and so is the person at the center of the story, but actually there are a lot of other people, a lot of women who were hugely integral to that particular dramatic point. I mean, this is something I loved so much about the secrets we kept in discussing the CIA operation behind Dr. Zhivago. It wasn't just Boris Pasternak who was the star of the story. There were all these really fascinating women who were part of that chorus.
Well, we're getting almost to time, but I can't let this event end without talking a little bit about the fantastic cover art.
Loved it.
Can you talk a little bit about that, Anna? Did you have any say in the design process, or how did that work?
I had a little bit of say, but I really can't take too much credit for this. Simon and Schuster sent me a couple of different options for covers early in the process, and this was one of the, I want to say, 3 options they sent. And we all agreed collectively as a team almost right away that, like, this was the one. I love the way that it kind of evokes that that glamour and intrigue of the past, the sense of, this is a story that takes place at a different moment, the elegance of this woman and this sort of faceless man. But the treatment and the type clearly gives it that, that kind of spy thriller energy. I think one tweak that we adjusted later on was, you can see the Eiffel Towers. How am I pointing? The Eiffel Tower is right there. And in earlier versions of the cover, I think it was a little bit smaller or harder to see. And we're like, you know what? A big part of the reason why I loved writing this story, and why I think a lot of people have responded to it, is the Paris love story element. It is, it's very much, a story that sweeps you off to that time and place. So we decided to play that up a little bit, because especially in this day and age, who doesn't want to, open a book and pretend to be in Paris for a little while?
The magic of books.
Exactly.
Oh, it's absolutely gorgeous. I can see it surrounded in lights, hanging in a movie theater. I mean, it's absolutely lovely. Well,
Yeah, they really nailed it. I love the cover. I remember when I saw it, I was like, this is fantastic.
Yeah, they did. I loved it from the get-go.
Well, we are already at time. Anna, before we go, when our readers pick up Our American Friend, what is the main thing that you hope that they take away from this book?
I hope, first and foremost, that this book just gives them pleasure and becomes a source of, escape for them. I think my favorite kind of novel to read is something that takes me out of my own life for a number of hours and just allows me to lose myself in that new world, with this whole set of characters. So I really hope that this book can just be, even though it tackles some weighty themes and subjects, that it can really just be fun for readers to devour and to enjoy. But I also hope that, when you finish the book, when you put it down, then maybe it causes you to ask certain questions or think about things a little bit differently, whether it's about the women that we overlook in history, whether it's about the role that first ladies play in our current culture. I love fiction that is a true pleasure to read, but that also, raises certain questions for you. And that's what I hope readers take from this.
Well, thank you both. Anna, thank you, Lara. It has been a pleasure and an honor. Our American Friend. Grab your copies now. Signed copies, again, available at BookHampton, and signed book plates are available at RJ Julia and Wesley and RJ Julia. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We can't thank you enough for supporting your local independent bookstores and our authors. We thank you. So have a wonderful night and happy reading. Good night.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Night.
Bye.